I do think that, local news organizations have to work really hard to become indispensable to their local communities. One way they can do that is do exactly what we were talking about before, is through investigative reporting. I know at the Globe, one of the major reasons that people subscribe is because of the investigative work that the Globe continues to do and to do so well. People, they don't see anybody else doing that kind of work. And so they see it as a cause.
Tonight we celebrate the First Amendment. The Ford Hall Forum First Amendment Award was created in 1981 by the children, nieces, and nephews of Louis P. and Evelyn Smith, longtime devotees and leaders in the forum, to honor those individuals and organizations who demonstrate extraordinary commitment to promoting and facilitating the thoughtful exercise of our right to freedom of expression. This evening we honor Marty Baron with the 2019 First Amendment Award. Marty is the executive editor of the Washington Post and former editor of the Boston Globe. Newsrooms under his leadership have won 14 Pulitzer Prizes. The Post has won 4, and during his 11-and-a-half-year tenure at the Boston Globe, the Globe won 7 awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 2003 for its investigation into clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. Coverage portrayed years later in the Academy Award-winning movie Spotlight. Marty is the recipient of many honors and awards, including Editor of the Year by the National Press Foundation in 2004, his induction in the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2012, the Al Newharth Award for Excellence in the Media in 2017, and honorary doctorates, including one from his alma mater, Lehigh University. Marty, the forum honors you for your powerful, dogged, determined, and fearless defense of the First Amendment, one of the greatest constitutional rights in our country. Your relentless pursuit of the truth over your storied career and your stalwart defense of journalists, especially in these harrowing times for the Fourth Estate, have resulted in impact and important journalism with implications for years to come. Marty, I am so honored to present this award to you. Will you please step forward?
This is a great honor. And as you said, when we walk into our newsroom at the Washington Post every day, we do see the principles of the Washington Post that were set down in 1935. And the first principle is to tell the truth as nearly as the truth may be ascertained. And that's the spirit of the Post. That's the same spirit that we had at the Boston Globe and that it still has today. That's the spirit, I think, in most newsrooms around the country. And it recognizes that that getting at the truth can be hard. The truth can be elusive. It's a process. But it also recognizes that there is such a thing as the truth. That it's not just a matter of your own personal opinion. It's not a matter of how big a megaphone you have or how much power you have. There's actually an underlying truth. And so we work to try to get at that. The way we do that, obviously, is through the freedoms that are granted to us under the First Amendment. A free press, of course, but also just generally freedom of expression and the right to air your grievances, the right to assembly, and even freedom of religion, which recognizes that all of those, I think, recognize that we can be independent thinkers, should be independent thinkers, and that we can question authority. And I think that's something that we have to do, and it's what James Madison imagined us doing when he crafted the First Amendment. And he talked about examining public characters and measures. So that's the spirit of accountability, the idea that all those who hold power should be held accountable. And so that is the spirit of the Washington Post. I think it's the spirit of the press generally in this country. And it's in that spirit that I want to thank you for giving me this great award. Thank you.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Meghna Chakrabarti, this evening's moderator, who also has an illustrious and noteworthy career. Meghna is the award-winning host and producer of NPR's On Point. In a Boston Magazine profile last week, she was named the voice of a new generation in Boston who is bringing Boston to the masses with her calmly inquisitive voice, emerging from the millions of speakers over 290 radio stations every Monday through Thursday. Please join me in welcoming this evening's moderator, Meghna Chakrabarti.
Is it on?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's on.
great. Well, good evening, everybody. And first of all, I would just like to thank everyone at the Ford Hall Forum for this incredible invitation to sit in conversation with Marty Baron. It is no exaggeration to say that many of us in this business for years have followed the lead and the example set by the newsrooms that Marty Baron has run and continues to run to this day. So it is an absolute privilege to sit here next to you. As was noted, the more than century-long history of this forum championing the champions of liberty as well. The vigorous defense of those liberties continues to be as important as ever. And I do believe that Marty Baron and the work that he has done and the many journalists that he has inspired and edited and led remain at the vanguard of essential liberties in this country. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to start, Marty, if I could, with a very big picture question for you. I mean, this is a tremendous time in the news business. In a way, the opportunities abound in terms of stories to cover, but it's also obviously a very perilous time as well. And you frequently said that your reporters, or reporters in general, are not at war, even with the president who might consider the media the enemy. They're simply at work. But I want to know what your overall view is of the health of our collective, the nation's collective belief in the importance of the First Amendment.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think that it depends on who you talk to. I think that for a long time, the American public took the press for granted and took the First Amendment generally for granted. And free expression for granted. I don't think that that's the case anymore in this country. I think that over the last several years, people have begun to better understand the role, particularly of the press, in our democracy, and to focus on that, and to recognize its importance in holding our government accountable and holding other powerful institutions and individuals accountable. But obviously, we live in a very polarized society today, more polarized than I think any of us has seen before. And people are very divided on the press. And there are a large segment of the population has a very low opinion of the press, and I think is not as supportive of the liberties that we have, or they think that we take too many liberties, and that we're not as responsible as we ought to be. And that somehow we should be better controlled in some fashion. So I think that we still have a lot of education to do about the role of the press in this country and why it's essential to our democracy. So I think things are a bit better than they were in the past, because I don't think we should be taken for granted. And I think a lot of people don't take us for granted anymore. And yet I think that there's a huge segment of the American population that has little confidence in us and is not what I would view as adequately appreciative of our contribution to a democratic system.
Well, so with that having sort of set the table, we'll come back to this issue
I figured we would.
quite a bit. But I do actually, I want to get a chance to do like sort of a mini real-time Marty Baron profile as well. So you were born in Tampa, Florida.
Yes.
Did you always want to be a newspaper man? I mean, what was the young Marty Baron's hopes and dreams?
Well, I don't know about always. It took a while to develop. So, look, I think pretty much ever since high school and even junior high school, I was interested in it. I think a lot of that was because my parents had immigrated to this country. They were keenly interested in what was happening in this country and what was happening around the world. They had a regular habit of consuming news. We got our local newspaper. There were no national newspapers at the time, of course. We watched the nightly news every night, Huntley-Brinkley report, and then watched the local news as well. And then they got Time magazine every week. And that was the habit in our household and my family traveled a fair amount, so I got around the world, and I became interested in sort of world affairs, and this was a way to be interested in it. And I guess I picked up something in picking up that newspaper every single day and reading what was going on, and it was a way for me to be sort of engaged in those kinds of subjects.
You know, just you describing the rich diversity of really powerful news sources that landed at your doorstep when you were growing up. It feels like things have changed quite a bit because yes, we can have this huge diversity of sources every time I turn on my phone, but the reliable, in-depth, reporting-based news and news organizations, of course, have shrunk so dramatically that it seems like we're in a completely different world. Young people today are in a completely different world than what you just described.
Well, they have both more and they have less. I mean, obviously, people have access to a lot more sources of information these days than they had before. All they have to do is go onto the internet. Many of those sources are highly reliable, and many of those sources are highly unreliable. And a lot of local newspapers have sadly disappeared. The newspaper that I received at home doesn't exist anymore, the Tampa Tribune. I did 3 summers of internships at the Tampa Tribune, and it's sad to see a newspaper like that go away. And particularly with coverage of local news, I think is threatened. It is the single biggest crisis, in my view, in journalism today. And I think we have to think very hard about the contributions that local newspapers and major metropolitan newspapers make to their communities, because I believe that they are essential.
Yeah.
Without them, you wouldn't have politicians being held accountable. You wouldn't have other powerful interests being held accountable in these communities. You wouldn't be informed about what's happening in your own neighborhoods and in your own city.
So I hear you saying that from the time you were young, you were raised in an environment of inquiry, exploration, inquisitiveness. But what made you, after college, say, I'm going to go down this path? I'm going to news is where I want to be. I'm thinking of all these young people here who are facing a similar decision someday.
Well, when I got into college, I thought I wanted to go into journalism, and I studied journalism, but I also got an MBA at the same time. Because I wasn't sure that it was all going to work out so well. So I should probably have something to fall back on. And I couldn't be sure that my interest in journalism would be sustained. But I also knew that journalism was becoming more specialized, so I thought it would be good to learn an actual subject other than journalism, which is not a subject in and of itself, really. So
That's still good advice today, I'd say.
I did that. I think it's important to know something other than journalism itself. So I did that, and then when I graduated, I was pretty sure that I wanted to go into journalism, but all the people around me were, they were working through the college placement offices, and they were being interviewed by businesses coming through. And I thought, oh, well, I don't know, maybe I should do that and see what it's like. And I did go through a couple of interviews, and I was incredibly bored by these other things. And obviously one of the recruiters could detect that, because he said, well, look, what do you really want to do? And I said, well, I want to be a journalist. He said, well, why don't you go do that? And so, don't take up my time was the other message there. And I realized then that that's in fact what I wanted to do. But no newspapers were sending anybody to Lehigh University, my alma mater, to go find journalists. So I had to apply, and so I applied and was accepted in a few places.
So your early career took you to the Miami Herald,
Yep.
right? And then also to the LA Times after that.
Yeah, right. And I should have mentioned, by the way, that I was actively involved in my school newspaper. I became editor of my school newspaper in my junior year. And I spent more time, like a lot of college journalists, I spent more time on the school newspaper than I did with classes. So, but yeah, so when I got out, I got hired at the Miami Herald. I worked in a little town, 12,000 people in the town of Stuart, Florida. I was a native Floridian. I didn't even know how to spell Stuart. I spelled it wrong when they told me that's where they were going to put me. I spelled it S-T-E-W-A-R-T, and it was S-T-U-A-R-T. And I was looking for it on the map, and I finally found it. I accepted the job before I knew where it was. So 12,000 people in the town, 50,000 people in the county. And we had to produce a page a day, 6 days a week, take our own photographs. You'd take, they used film in those days, and you'd take the photographs, you'd take the film out, you put it on the 10:30 bus to Miami, which was a couple of hours south, and and you'd produce a page every single day. So
Over there in that corner, minds are being blown right now.
it was
Film? Bus?
called early multimedia journalism. So until I eventually moved to Boca Raton, and they actually, in Palm Beach County, Florida, they had their own photography staff, which they didn't have where I was, and I continued to take photographs until the photo staff said the photos were so bad. They demanded that they take the camera out of my hands and let the professional staff do their jobs.
Was there anything about those early experiences that gave you a sense of what makes for great journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, it was. I mean, you covered people who were powerful in their own community. It was not that they were powerful at the national level, but they had influence in your own community, and you realized if you didn't cover some of the stuff they were doing, nobody would really know about it. And in some of these small towns, some really crazy stuff happens. I mean, it's really crazy. I mean, we had the mayor of Stewart at the time was always talking about the aliens who were coming to town. And I didn't know what he was talking about initially. And he wasn't talking about immigrants, by the way. He was talking about people coming up from Miami. And he was really upset about that. And it's sort of crazy stuff that happens at the local level, and you realize you really have to dig into what's going on.
Yeah. Well, so when you became executive editor at the Miami Herald, we're sort of jumping forward in time here, there were two very consequential stories that happened there under your watch. Bush v. Gore and the recount in Florida, and then also the raid to recover Elian Gonzalez.
Right.
Of course. What was it like to cover those stories?
Well, Elian Gonzalez was first because that story had started just before I came there. He was picked up at sea. His mother died at sea. It was a raging already the beginnings of a raging controversy in Miami. Obviously, the Cuban-American community in Miami very much wanted him to stay. He had relatives in Miami, not people he knew, but they were his relatives. And they felt that returning him to Cuba, where his father was living, as you may recall, would be like as if somebody had thrown a kid over the Berlin Wall and you said, okay, let's throw him back. Whereas people who were not Cuban-American said, well, but he has a father. His father's in Cuba. He should be with a parent. And so there were very different perspectives. It was incredibly intense, very passionate. People saw bias in pretty much every story. I would come into the office in the morning, and there would be the little red light on that meant that there were messages there for me in the old systems, and I'd start listening to the message, and somebody would say, criticizing us for a story that we did, that we were pandering to Cuban Americans, and then I would listen to the next message, and it was about the same story, and it was someone who was so-called Anglo, who was saying that. Who had the Anglos would say we were pandering to the Cuban Americans, and the Cuban Americans were saying we were biased against Cuban Americans. And we were talking about the very same story. It was incredibly passionate. And there were even divisions within our newsroom because we had a lot of Cuban Americans in our newsroom, and they saw and people saw things through very different perspectives.
So how did you handle those internal newsroom divisions then?
Well, we had a tricky one at one time. I mean, we had one of the staffers who was actually writing our lead story every day, who was Puerto Rican American, and he was just watching the television, and there was one of these protests, and he said something like, "Oh, those people are crazy," and the use of "crazy" with Cuban Americans is very upsetting to them, and understandably, and it just swept through the newsroom about how this guy was biased, he shouldn't be on our story, we need to deal with this, this is outrageous. And, he said, look, I was just joking. So I had to meet with, it was a crisis. I had to meet with every single staff. And I said, look, this is a very sensitive story. Everything we say, everything we do is going to be judged, and it's going to be out in the community. And so on this story, no jokes, no jokes. So the word that went around in the newsroom is that Marty has declared that we will no longer have jokes in the newsroom. I had to issue a clarification that it's okay to tell jokes, just not on that subject. So, but it was very divisive in the community and within the newsroom at times.
So I was racking my memory of the stories that I, read and consumed about Elian Gonzalez at the time. And it occurred to me, obviously not living in Florida, that my primary news source for this was television.
Right.
And because this was one of the earliest stories that I can remember that had a very strong visual component, so there was a lot of television coverage. I'm wondering what you saw as the differences between how this story was portrayed on mass broadcast television versus how you were reporting it as Florida journalists.
Yeah, well, I think
Florida
that
newspaper journalists.
I
should
think
say.
that if I recall correctly, I think so much of the television coverage focused on Cuban Americans protesting in the streets. And that is visual, but I don't think that it was entirely representative of what was happening. Most of it was just going on in people's homes. They were thinking about what their life had been like in Cuba, why they had to leave Cuba, the relatives that they had left behind, the prospects for Cuba in the future, the lack of freedom, the lack of opportunity for people, and they were very upset that this boy they saw he became a symbol, and he became a symbol, and so they. I don't think that was adequately captured on television and in a lot of the coverage. And I think as I reflect on what we did, I think we could have spent even more time really exploring that and the sentiments of the Cuban American community and why they felt the way they did. Because I think a good portion of the American population did just sort of think of them as crazy, and that's not the case. They're people who their lived experiences are what inform their view of what should happen with Elian Gonzalez.
I mean, that's the truth of that lingers in every story, right? People's lived experiences are what inform how they view the issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And people can debate what should have happened there. Ultimately, of course, there was a raid to take him back that Janet Reno ordered and was executed. And they took him back. His father was waiting for him in Washington, and they delivered him to his father, and then his father went back to Cuba, and he's now considered like a national hero in Cuba. I'm sure the family's well taken care of. So people can debate that. But I think it's really important for us as journalists to really spend a lot of time understanding why people have the opinions they do, how they develop these views, and understand them at a deep level, and be better listeners.
Bush v. Gore and the recount.
Right. Well, ultimately, as you know, there was no recount.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. That was the problem. That was the issue, is whether there should be a recount. So, we ended the election. There was no clear winner. And so the Gore campaign insisted on a recount. Initially, the recount was to be in several counties. And then there was a request for a statewide recount. It went to the Florida Supreme Court. The Florida Supreme Court ordered a recount, but then that was appealed by the Bush camp to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that there would be no recount. And so Bush was declared the winner, and it made, obviously, Florida was the state that determined who would win that election. So we decided as a news organization, Florida has this wonderful, you should try it here in Massachusetts, this incredible public records law, goes back to the Sunshine Law.
Yes.
Governor Ruben Askew went, as the one who pushed for it way back when. There's just, it's a very expansive law. It gives you access to an enormous number of records. Unfortunately, the state has dialed that back a bit on supposed privacy grounds, but it's still better than in most states. And so we determined that every ballot is actually a public record. Mm-hmm. So we could go into every state, into every county, and actually count all the ballots one by one. And so that's what we decided to do. The CEO of the chain that owned us, Knight Ridder, said, well, he thought it would be a good idea if we had a major accounting firm do account along with us. And we said that we thought that would be a good idea. And he said, well, what do you think it'll cost? And I said, I thought it was going to cost a lot. It's probably going to cost $250,000. And he said, okay, go ahead. Well, it cost $850,000, and I survived that, and he supported us. We couldn't get the biggest firms to join us. It was too radioactive. They didn't want to do that, and we were being portrayed as engaging in a sort of effort to delegitimize the Bush presidency. And the biggest accounting firms, I think it was Big Six at the time, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So we went to the next level down. And we got BDO Seidman to do it with us. And they agreed, at least the Miami office agreed. We finally signed the contract. Like many accounting firms, they don't actually certify anything. If you actually read the language, they haven't really said anything. They don't promise anything about it. But they would do the count with us. Side by side, we would do independent counts. And then, of course, their main office in New York found out about it and apparently was furious that they had agreed to do this, but the contract had already been signed. So they were obligated. And so we went to all of the 67 counties in Florida, one by one. And occasionally we had to litigate against the supervisor of elections in that county to give us access to the ballots. But each one was ultimately held up. And we would look, and if you recall, there were the hanging chads.
Yes.
So, these perforations, they were partial or, and then different counties had different systems, and you had to decide so we needed to look at it under different measurements as to what counts as a vote. What did not count as a vote would be something like in Palm Beach County, where they had the infamous butterfly ballot, where people thought they were voting for Al Gore, but they actually they ended up voting for Pat Buchanan. And people were confused by the ballot. We couldn't say, oh, they must have been thinking about Al Gore. You had to count that as a vote for Pat Buchanan. So,
these are just two examples of how, even in your earlier career as an editor, as the leader of a newsroom, you found yourself repeatedly in these situations where your newsroom's job was to cover essentially unprecedented events. Can you just walk us through your decision-making process on how to do that? How do you deploy the resources, the people that you have, especially when the stories very quickly become obvious that they're going to be big? And has that decision-making process become harder as the speed of the news has accelerated over time?
yeah. By the way, I should mention that when we did our count, it showed that Bush won. So just to be clear on that. And then everybody forgot that they'd accused us of trying to delegitimize the election. So well, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm not sure it's changed very much in the current environment, particularly for deeply involved stories like that. I think what you have to decide is, A, should you do it? And I think that if you're trying to get at the truth, as I was talking about moments ago, you generally say, yes, let's do it, regardless of whatever the criticism is. Because our job it's not a popularity contest with us. It shouldn't be. We're not trying to pander to any group where we shouldn't be. We're not trying to placate any group where we shouldn't be. We're just trying to get at the facts. Now, people may not understand it at the time, but that's what we should do. And so you decide to go ahead, and then you figure out, well, what are the resources that are required in order to do this and to do it right. And now, of course, with the people expect to get information instantaneously. That does pose extra pressures on us. There's no question about it. I think it's one of the greatest challenges that we face today. But if you have to take the time, then you just take the time. And you'd rather get it right than otherwise. And so, but it's a hugely competitive environment. And but the consequences of making a big mistake they're huge. So you have to be careful too. So how do you balance those things? It's a huge challenge.
How do you balance those things?
The best you can.
Well, obviously, we want to talk for a little bit about your time here in Boston at the Globe. But before we get that, get to that, there's actually something that I wanted to ask you about the clergy sex abuse series with the Spotlight team, and also with some of the stories that you've overseen at the Post. And the reason why is because I was remembering that David Fahrenthold at the Washington Post, who of course won the Pulitzer Prize for his coverage of the Trump Foundation, he's told this great story about how after one of the debates in the Republican primary in 2016, he says that he ran into you in an elevator late one evening.
Waiting for the elevator, yeah.
Yeah, and that you said, hey, maybe you want to look into the Trump Foundation a little bit. It's a short conversation, apparently. And I bring that up because similarly, the story goes with the Spotlight team at the Globe is that, if I'm getting this right, that you'd read Eileen McNamara's original column about the Gagin case the Sunday before your first day at the Globe, right? I mean, we all saw the movie. Some of us lived it here. And that you had asked, well, why are these records sealed? So my question is, those were two of the exactly right questions, right? Like, why don't we look into the Trump Foundation? Why are those records sealed? They are so simple. Those questions are so simple, but they were the laser-like questions that opened up these enormous stories that no one had known the extent of. How did you know that those were the right questions to ask?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we all should be just ask good questions. That's what we do for a living, basically, is be curious and interested. And with Fahrenthold, it was basically he had done something about a Trump charity where he had represented that he had given money to veterans, and it turned out he hadn't given money to veterans. He had announced that at a rally and made a whole big deal out of it, and it turned out he had never actually written a check. And then he called him on it, and he found out that he had not written a check, and he wrote about that. And I said to him, well, if he does this in a public setting, I wonder what he does in a private setting. I mean, it's like, what would happen in a private setting? Because if he goes out publicly and says, I'm writing a check, and he doesn't actually write a check, then what's happening with his own foundation? Maybe we should look at that. And he goes, yeah, we should. And then before you knew it, David was producing all these stories about his foundation and how he wasn't actually, he was using the foundation for sort of basically his own self-interest and self-dealing. On the church thing, look, I got here and I was just looking for good stories. It's very simple. It's like, what are we going to write about? To be honest, I was coming from Miami, and Miami is a very busy news town. It's like, all sorts of crazy stuff happens there. I always say the news just washes up on the shore, and it actually often does. We had great offices there, and my office, it was the best office I had, a lot better than the one at the Globe, where I just looked at the expressway, but there I got to look at the bay, and often, bodies would just wash up on shore, so you always had to keep an eye out, And so I was a little nervous that, that Boston might not be as exciting and dynamic and what have you. And so I was just like, well, what are the good stories? And I was, in the 3 weeks I had between jobs, I was frantically reading the paper and looking at what's going on and trying to learn as much about Boston as I possibly could. And lo and behold, so Eileen's column came up, and I had met Eileen by then because I'd gotten around to meet people. And it's this column, and she basically at the end, she had the lawyer for the plaintiffs saying that the cardinal himself knew about Gagin and knew about his abuse and reassigned him from parish to parish, and she had the archdiocese saying that those were baseless charges, those were irresponsible, and then at the end she said the truth may never be known because the documents are under court seal. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting because, first of all, to have a cardinal being aware of abuse, serial abuse by a priest, and then reassigning him from one place to the next, and we can't really document it, but there are documents that might actually show what you have. And so I was really curious. I thought, well, that's a great story. And so I came in, and we talked about what was happening for the day, and that was my first news meeting, and it wasn't mentioned. And so I asked about it, and what can we get at the truth of the matter here? And it was pointed out that the documents were under seal, which I knew because I'd read the column. So she said, and so then I said, well, I don't really know the laws of Massachusetts, but in Florida, we do have this great public records law, and these aren't public records, but we'd be inclined to sort of try to get at these. Have we thought about going to court to try to unseal? And people hadn't, because I don't think people thought they would be successful necessarily, and because I think the Globe had covered a previous case of Father Porter, and they thought they'd kind of pretty much done the story of abuse. But anyway, so then we went on to do that, and to talk to our outside lawyer, John Albano, here, who then gave us his counsel on what might happen. And I remember just finishing up the conversation with him, and him saying, and then we just said, okay, well, what's the bottom line? What are our chances of prevailing? And he said, like any lawyer, 50-50. So those are really good odds for journalists, 50-50 is really good odds. So we went ahead.
So,
and we had just a fabulous spotlight team. And after that, it was like I didn't need to do anything because they were off to the races and did a great job of investigating and staying on that story for a long time, not just a year, but beyond a year. I think we must have done 600 stories in the first year and 900 stories in the first year and a half. And there was just it became not only a story about what was happening here in the diocese here, but what was happening throughout the country and around the world as well.
I was a freshman radio producer when the first stories came out, and I will always have an abiding memory of our newsroom in WBUR, like everyone almost simultaneously in the morning opening up the Globe to read the next story in the series because it was so stunning and such a revelation and such a profound spotlight being shown on just egregious abuse of trust, of faith, of the system. I mean, it was definitely a landmark. We have the stories themselves, the movie. I know you've talked about this a lot, but is there any aspect of that experience as editor of the Globe in the course of all those 900 stories you were talking about that you haven't discussed? That's something about it that that really, I don't know if it changed your view of what you do and how you do it, or further informed how you continue to seek other big stories like that.
I don't know. I mean, I've talked about it so much that I'm not sure there's much left. Okay. But, I mean, I've talked about how, it's not as if this issue hadn't been raised within the church before. Mm-hmm. So it was, Father Thomas Doyle was in the church and arguing for reform for a long time. And I remember he wrote me a letter after we came out with a book called Betrayal, and about just full of praise for the work that the staff at the Globe had done. And it had involved not just the Spotlight team, but lots of other people on the staff as well. And he basically said that this would not have been done without the work of the Globe and the staff of the Globe, and that the victims were finally heard, the survivors were finally heard, and he was just incredibly grateful for that. And to me, I just left that letter on my desk the entire time that I was in Boston. It was just sitting right there. And just as a reminder of what our mission is in journalism, lest I forget. I don't think I would have been inclined to forget, but it was just in case I would forget, because it just means that we can have a tremendous impact if we use our resources correctly. And it was a reminder that we just always needed to try to get at the truth, and not worry about the powers that might be arrayed against us.
Now, you had mentioned that when you first came to the Globe that you didn't really know much about Boston. But in the years that you spent as editor at the Globe, you saw a great deal about the city and the region. I'm wondering if there was anything in particular that you learned about Boston that you want to share with us from your particular perch as editor?
Yeah, well, I'm still considered an outsider, so there you go. I mean, look, I mean, I think that I really did not know much about the place. I just passed through. I remember being interviewed about how much time I'd spent in Boston. I said, oh, I visited a number of times, and it's the failure to ask the follow-up question. It's like, well, what's the number? It was like 1.5. And so I thought that was genius of me to say a number, and that, and I really didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't know my way around. I'd have to put the map in my back pocket. You know, you didn't have mobile phones then, so I'd have to put the map in my back pocket. If I had to consult it, I would go into a dark corner, turn my back, afraid that, you know, the competitive newspaper would be there with a camera watching me look at the map. It was like unnerving. But I mean, I think that the thing that stuck with me, to tell you the truth, was this outsider thing. I mean, when I first came here, and I would give talks to breakfast groups and things like that, people would always ask at the beginning, they would say, well, how is Boston different from all the other places that you've worked? Because I'd worked in many places. And I said, well, in all the other places, I was called a newcomer. Here I was called an outsider. And I think that told you something. The vocabulary says something, right? So, and I think that, and I said this to actually a breakfast group before I left, is that they asked, what would you change? And I said, I would change that, because it's an amazing city. There are people at the vanguard of their fields, really great people, and everybody should be made to feel welcome. That word should be banished, in my view, from the vocabulary of Boston. And it's this incredible cosmopolitan place. And people shouldn't be made to feel like outsiders. And I do know people who who came here from other places, and many of them still feel that way, even after they've been here a lot longer than I was here. So, I remember, after I left, actually, a particular columnist for the other newspaper described me as the carpetbagger editor of the Boston Globe. I thought, well, that's interesting. I was there for 11.5 years.
Well, we've been talking a lot about, the big, really sort of historic stories that have come out of your newsrooms. I'm wondering, are there any that got away? Any stories that got away that you didn't see through to publication, that you really, that you wanted to see through all the way through to publication?
Sure, there are plenty of stories, and yeah.
You can't talk about them?
Depends.
Depends. So which ones can you tell us about?
Look, if any story had met our standards for publication, we would have published it. I guarantee you. So.
Okay. That's a smart legal answer. All right. So I spent a lot of time before I was at On Point reporting out of our local newsroom here. So I'm particularly interested in what you think about the health of local news, especially since you've spent so much time doing that. I just want to read just one quick statistic to people. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that in the year 2000, newspapers across the country employed 425,000 people. 425,000 people in the year 2000. And by 2016, that had dropped to 183,000. So almost a 60% drop. Most of those in local newsrooms. So the health of local journalism is very, very dire, I'd say. I mean, can anything be done to truly turn that around?
Well, I don't know. I think that's the big question, is that sort of what is the model for local journalism? And I think people are still struggling to figure that out. As I said before, I think the single biggest crisis in American journalism is at the local level. Look, when we were acquired by Jeff Bezos in October of 2013, the first thing he said to us is that we needed to change our strategy, because ours was really oriented toward regional strategy for Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. And yes, we covered national politics and all of that, but our customer base was regional. And he said, you need to become national. And we need to do it right away, and you need to be digital. Said all the pillars of your industry have been essentially obliterated. What you had was a great model for the past, not such a great model for the present or for the future. So the internet has inflicted all this pain, but the internet also has given you a gift. And the gift is worldwide distribution at virtually no additional cost. And you're ideally positioned to take advantage of this because you're in the nation's capital. You have the name, The Washington Post, which can be leveraged to a national and even international level. And because you have a history and tradition going back to Watergate that defines your identity. In short, we didn't need to go off to a retreat to figure out who we were. So we did that. But not every newspaper can do that, or local news organization can do that. That option, that was a really smart strategic move for us, and it really saved us because we were losing tons of money, and now we're making money, and we're reinvesting that money. But for most local news organizations, they don't have that option, so they have to find a different strategy. I do think that local news organizations have to work really hard to become indispensable to their local communities. One way they can do that is do exactly what we were talking about before, is through investigative reporting. I know at the Globe, I mean, one of the major reasons that people subscribe is because of the investigative work that the Globe continues to do and to do so well. People, they don't see anybody else doing that kind of work. And so they see it as a cause, not just as a purchase, not just as a purchase of a product, but as a cause to belong to. And I think that's really important. I remember when I was at the Globe, and every time the Spotlight would come out with something, I would get these emails from people and say, that's really great, it's so great you did it, that's why we need the Globe, that's why we need newspapers. If it hadn't been for you, nobody else would have done it. And it was great. I loved that, except that it would like come once every 6 months, and I went to our Metro editor, Jen Peter, and said, can we do more rapid, maybe we can set up a team to do more rapid turnaround so that I can get more of these emails more frequently, if for no other reason. But, and so we did set up that team, and I think it's now been consolidated, understandably. Is that right? Because people appreciate that, because they know that there's nobody else doing it, and they want somebody to represent the citizens in holding their government and other powerful institutions accountable. So I think it's important to invest in investigative reporting. I think it's important to charge. I think that the business model is such that the advertising model is tough for all news organizations because much of the advertising is being sucked up by the major platforms, tech platforms, Google, Facebook, to some extent Apple, Amazon, all of those. They're just sucking. It's like a big giant vacuum cleaner that's taking all of the advertising, and it's harder for news organizations. So, and the rates just keep going down. And so we need to charge, and people need to pay, and people need to know that that they really have to pay in order to get that information, that it's not free. Our owner likes to say, we just have to explain to the public that, that free news, that was just all a big misunderstanding. It was a miscommunication. You now have to pay, and because it costs money to do this kind of work.
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious. I've got several more questions to you, but I will open the floor to for questions from all of you here in just a few minutes. it's obviously in the history of the Washington Post, it's not at all unusual for the executive editor to have a relationship with the occupant of the White House. Does the president, does he call you? What does he say when he does?
We don't have a relationship. So, I mean, he's called me twice, basically to yell at me for some couple of stories that we had that he didn't like. Shock. And that was it. He hasn't called back. I don't think he got any satisfaction out of the phone call, so he hasn't called back.
I guess he has Twitter to complain. He's got Twitter to yell at you through.
Yeah, he doesn't need to call me. He can just try to turn the public against us, which is what he has tried to do. Not just against us, but against other media organizations by name and the media generally. And the objective there is really to disqualify the press as an independent arbiter of fact. And you know, to be honest about it, not just to disqualify the press as an independent arbiter of fact, but to disqualify other independent arbiters of fact. So law enforcement, intelligence agencies, the courts, scientists, historians, you name it. So that the only source of truth for his supporters is himself, he alone, as he might put it. So, and so that's what he's tried to do, is to really basically not just delegitimize us. He has tried to delegitimize us, but to discredit us completely as a source of information. And you know, sad to say, he's had some success with certain segments of the population. I think the important thing is that we just keep doing what we're doing, and we make sure it's right, and we make sure that it's, I think in the long run, it will be validated. And I think that we've seen that in the Mueller report, for example. A lot of all this stuff that he declared to be fake news, well, it turned out that it was, it's in the Mueller report. If you read the Mueller report, it validates all the reporting that took place, certainly the kind of reporting that we did. Sure, there was all sorts of speculation out there on television with television pundits or what have you, periodic speculation. But the reporting that was done by mainstream news organizations, particularly us and I think and the New York Times, has been validated in that report. It shows that the reporting that we did was both highly relevant and factual.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, the president, to be perfectly blunt about it, he's been wildly successful amongst certain, you know, groups of Americans at undermining the trust that they have in the media. But there's also, I mean, in the day and age we're living in, there are also groups out there that are actively engaged in working hard to further undermine the credibility of journalists and journalism outlets. And specifically, I'm thinking of, you know, groups like Project Veritas, quote unquote Veritas. I hope, do people here, you know about Project Veritas? Oh, okay. So it's a group who basically they go out and do sting operations, not just on journalists but politicians, et cetera. They video record it, put it out on the internet, basically, and say you can't trust these.
Right,
folks.
but it's distorted. It's
distorted,
out of context. They slice and dice the film so that it's highly misleading.
That's right. They edit it to craft a narrative that didn't really exist. And for example, they tried to undermine the reporting of the Washington Post as Post reporters were uncovering allegations of abuse against Roy Moore in Alabama. A woman had come forth to one of the reporters claiming that she had a sexual relationship with Moore that ended up in an abortion. And she was offering all this information to one of the Post reporters. But of course, the Post found inconsistencies in what she was saying. And it turned out that she was a plant from Project Veritas. And the Post stung them back.
We did a reverse sting.
Sting. I mean, you actually should go and look at the reporting that they did about this. Because my question, though, is, I mean, was that an extraordinary event, or how often is that a concern, given our political environment, that sources may be activists trying to undermine the very work that you're doing?
I don't think. I thought you were going to ask how often we do reverse stings, which is not very often. But that's the only one that I can remember. But we worry about it a lot. I don't think it happens a lot, but it only needs to happen once before your credibility could be destroyed if you fell for something like that. That's why if somebody comes to us with an accusation, we check it out, like, really thoroughly. On the Roy Moore stuff, there were 3 women who made very serious allegations against him, and particularly one who with whom he had sexual contact when she was a teenager, and by her allegation, and so we needed to know everything about these women. We needed to know their entire background. We needed to get them to tell us everything that they could, and then we used all the available public resources to check them out. What kind of debts did they have? Had they ever been accused of anything? You name it. Everything about them, and so that we can be absolutely confident that what we publish is going to be true. And so when Project Veritas did this, tried to do a sting on us, we started checking out this individual, and the story, she didn't hold up, and the story didn't hold up, and then we realized we were being set up, and then we decided to bring along the video team and have a microphone and all of that, and then we found out, we assumed, we sort of figured out where she lived. And then when we figured out where she lived, we figured out pretty much who she worked for.
Right.
And then we waited for her to go to work on Monday morning. And we just followed her in a car. And it went right to Project Veritas. So.
Well, I'm going to invite anyone who has a question for Marty Baron. Please come up to one of the microphones. But just at least one last question from me here, because there is something that I believe deserves our deeper attention, because we're talking about the health of the nation's belief in the core tenets of the First Amendment. And I went back yesterday and watched the Super Bowl ad that the Washington Post had this year, and it shows all these great these transformational moments in history. Also, it shows images of journalists who given their lives in the course of their reporting. And Tom Hanks, doing his voiceover for this ad, he ends the ad by saying, "Knowing empowers us, knowing helps us decide, and knowing keeps us free." And of course, the Post's own slogan now is "Democracy dies in darkness." But I wonder if we're in a time where the deeper concern is, can a democracy die not just in darkness, but because the people are willingly keeping their eyes shut?
Well, that's another form of darkness, of course. I think it's a really good question. And I think the answer to that, of course, is yes. If you look at history and how democracies have died in the past, it's essentially been with the consent of the people. So the ultimate guardians of our system, the ultimate guardians of our democracy, it's not the press, it's the public. And so the public has to stand up for it. And if they don't support the institutions that make up a democracy, we're just one of them, by the way. There's the courts, the Congress, the elections, the integrity of the election system. All of these things are critical to a democracy, and the public has to stand up for that. And if they don't think it's that important, if they think that there are other things that just outweigh that, then yes, a democracy can die. Thank you.
It's an interesting segue, because my question had to do with that tagline, democracy dies in darkness, and I just wanted to hear some of the history behind that decision to add that.
Sure. So it was our owner, Jeff Bezos, wanted to have something that captured the essence of our mission as a news organization. We didn't have one. The New York Times did have one, if you may recall, all the news that's fit to print. It's a little dated. Couldn't help myself. And he wanted something that sort of gave a sense of what's the special mission that the Washington Post can offer, given who it is and where it is and what its history is, and how do we come up with a phrase that, that, as he said, that you actually could put it on a T-shirt, and it would be like a club that people would want to belong to because they believed in the cause. So we weren't entirely sure how this was going to be used. I think some of us just thought it was an advertising plan. There was a marketing plan. We didn't realize that it would be on every single product that we produce. So we had all sorts of ideas. Some of them really bad, thousands of them. I mean, all managers will sympathize with me when I say we just had meeting after meeting after meeting to discuss these things, and we went back and everybody was writing by committee, which is like the disaster. It's just the worst English phrases in English you've ever read, and they didn't make any sense, and it was just, we were going completely off the rails. But Bob Woodward had, in his speeches over the years, he'd always used this phrase, democracy dies in darkness. And he picked it up from a judge who made a ruling during the Watergate era when he said, democracy dies in the dark. And that had sort of stuck with us. And some of us were very hesitant to use it because darkness and death in your motto doesn't... It's not a natural thing to put in, and not a natural thing to put in your motto. So some of us, including me, I was a little hesitant to do that. But we tried light, and the problem with light was that it sounded either too self-adulatory, or it sounded like a cult. It's like the light, and it just sounded weird. It just sounded strange, and so we ended up saying, okay, democracy dies in darkness. There is a belief, I think, among Trump supporters that it was targeted at him. It was not targeted at him. It was introduced when he came into office, but we had started the process well before then, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with him. For those who are supporters of his who bring it up with me, I just, all I can say is, well, what about that phrase makes you think it's about him?
By the way, that judge that you're speaking about, that Woodward referenced, if I'm 90% confident about this, it's Damon Keith, right?
Yeah, you might be right. I have to look.
Who just passed away a couple of days ago, 96 years old. Was the longest serving African American federal court judge in the Detroit Federal Court, an enormous champion of civil rights. We're going to do a segment about him tomorrow, just FYI.
Okay. I was so impressed with your knowledge.
I went back and read the ruling. It's the wiretapping case that ended up going to the Supreme Court in the Nixon administration. I like to do my homework. But anyway, he's an extraordinary jurist in American legal history. So it's a good source to have your
Nice to know that he has achievements other than inspiring the motto for the Washington Post. That's good.
His achievements are many. But please go ahead, sir.
I'd like to ask, sort of on a level of your journalistic philosophy, how do you handle the issue of making the news versus just reporting the news? Because with the investigative journalism, you're obviously making a decision what you decide to investigate, what you don't decide to investigate, and how you report what you investigate. So in a sense, there's this new element of making the news, and what's your general approach to that responsibility?
I don't really see the world in terms of making the news or reporting the news. I think that the objective is to try to get at the facts and try to get at the truth. So, if you look at the investigation of the Catholic Church, you could say that we made the news. I mean, obviously without that work, all these things that have happened over the last 17 years would not have occurred. But that's our obligation. It's not just to report what people say. I think there's a huge difference between stenography and journalism. Journalism is about trying to find out, why is something happening? Or why is it not happening? Or who's behind this? Who's influencing it? Who's it going to affect? So looking at all of those sorts of things, it's not just a matter of sitting there and recording what anybody says and then in a stenographic fashion just reporting what it is they said. That's why there's a word called stenography, and then there's another word called journalism. And it's something, these are they're two different things, really. And journalism the effort is to take it to a deeper level. So sometimes you end up making the news because you've done an investigation and it sets off a series of events. So so I don't really frame it that way, making the news versus reporting the news. To me, it's a matter of how do we get at the facts and how do we know what's behind those facts, and who does it affect, who influenced it, those kinds of things.
I'm actually going to go over here since you were waiting first.
Thank you, and thank you for the work you do, and congratulations on your award. Regarding the clergy abuse scandal and crisis and the revelations that you and the team, the Spotlight team, did, thank you for focusing a spotlight on that. I wonder now, after all this time regarding that, whether or why I think a lot of folks in Boston think this story's been told and it's been done, and now we see across the country and across the world other things coming out, especially around Pennsylvania and New York and grand jury investigations and what have you. And I'm wondering sort of what your position would be around that. I know that there hasn't been one in Massachusetts. Tom Riley did a report, but not a grand jury investigation, and certainly not on all 4 archdioceses.
So the question is what exactly?
What is your position on whether or not this story has been followed up in a way in Boston that it needs to be followed up?
I think, well, as I said, we did 900 stories.
Yeah.
And people have done a lot of stories since then.
Yeah.
There are people in this room who've done those stories, done many of them. So I feel like, particularly with the Globe's attention, that there's been quite a bit of attention to the subject here and continues to be. I mean, I have to say that I'm much more concerned about other areas, not so much in the U.S., although some areas of the U.S., but in the developing world, where you don't have a vigorous press, you don't have necessarily a free press, you don't have legal authorities who are interested in looking at this, where the church has a lot of power, and where people simply deny that there's a problem. And if you look at where the church is actually growing, it's growing in the developing world. And I don't think you can deny the problem, and I don't see how the church has really tried to tackle that at all, in the same way that it hasn't tackled a lot of other issues that emerged from, have emerged over the last 2 decades. So, but I think here, I think that things have changed, both at the law enforcement end. Certainly the press is paying attention to it, so I think the level of accountability here is pretty good.
Thank you.
For those of you who don't know, I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Suffolk Journal, and I'm currently studying here at Suffolk University to be a journalist. But my question for you is, what differentiates a good journalist from a great journalist?
Well, there are a lot of things, but I mean, as we talked about, I think it's really important for journalists to be more impressed with what they don't know than with what they do know. There's a lot that we don't know, and the more you look at, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know everything. You just have more questions. So I think that's really important, and to be endlessly inquisitive, to always ask the next question, and to be a good listener. Krista Tippett of NPR wrote, a book, and one of her chapters or one of her themes is about being what she calls a generous listener, and I think it's a really great phrase. And I think that you look at, for example, the work that was done on the Catholic Church by the Globe. What we were able to do there is really listen to people who had not been listened to sufficiently before, and hear what they're saying, hear where they're coming from, listen to what really happened to them. And I think in so many instances, that's part of it, that we, too often we hear it, but we don't listen. We don't really listen. So I think it's obviously there are other qualities that come into play to be a great journalist, to be, let's say, a great writer or what have you, or great, you know, great in other media as well. But I think for all of them, the common theme um, is being more impressed with what you don't know than with what you do know, and being a really good listener.
I mean, talking about the challenges of democracy, one of the big concerns is the power of corporations and power of money on democracy. And you mentioned before the fact that the Washington Post was purchased by Jeff Bezos, and this is something that has been used against the Washington Post, that it has become an instrument of one individual and one company. Do you have any concern about that, and how would you address that particular criticism?
Right. Well, we're not owned by Amazon, but we are owned by Jeff Bezos, obviously a wealthy individual, and so you know, ever since I've been in journalism, people have complained about the nature of the ownership. When I worked for public companies, and everybody was subjected to quarterly financial results, and people wanted to keep the stock price up, everybody said, well, what a terrible thing, you know, that we have to do that. They're making cuts in order to prop up the stock, to keep the profits up. Wouldn't it be better if we were a private company? And then, you know, when you're I remember when I was at the Globe and we were losing a lot of money, and I remember people saying, well, wouldn't it be better if we were a nonprofit? And I said, well, we are. It's not voluntary, but it's not the solution, it's the problem. And then, so you have private ownership, and the private owners are going to be people who can afford to acquire the organization. So they'll be wealthy. And then they say, well, what about nonprofit? Well, most nonprofits just don't have the resources to do what we do. And so everybody says, well, there aren't enough people giving to nonprofits to support journalistic enterprises that can do the kind of work we do. You know, that's terrible. Well, I don't know, you gotta pick. You gotta pick one of those. And the reality is that we should have all of them. And the question is not what's the nature of the ownership, the structure of the ownership, but how do the owners behave? And I'm proud of how our owner has worked with us. He has brought both intellectual capital and financial capital. Everybody focuses on the financial capital, but the intellectual capital is critically important. I talked before about the change in strategy, made all the difference in the world. He doesn't treat us like a charity. We're expected to be a sustainable business enterprise. That's the whole idea, is to create a sustainable business model. If he were to treat us like a charity, I wouldn't want him to treat us like a charity, because if he got tired of the charity, we'd be in deep trouble. We wouldn't have used this opportunity to create a sustainable business enterprise. He's focused on the business tactics and strategies of the Washington Post. He doesn't get involved in the editorial coverage. He doesn't get involved in the news coverage. He's never suggested a story, critiqued a story, criticized a story, suppressed a story, done anything. He doesn't not even about Amazon or him or anything like that. And he's been in the news lately. So, he just doesn't do it. And he wants us to be independent. He's talked about that. He's been asked about that, particularly about whether he would get involved in coverage of Amazon or himself. And he gave an interview. He said, no, I wouldn't do that. It would be, as he put it, gross. It would be icky. It's not the phrase I would use, but it would, you know, that he said, when I'm 80 years old, I would be ashamed of myself if I did that. And I'm grateful that we have an owner like that, because not every owner would behave that way. And so it's given us a tremendous amount of freedom. And he understands our mission. He believes in our mission. He wants us to make independent judgments, and he supports us, you know, every step of the way. And God knows he's come in for under a lot of pressure, and unfair pressure, in my view. I mean, I think it's clearly unfair pressure, because he doesn't get involved in our news coverage, and yet he's taken a lot of heat for it. So I don't think it's a matter of like what is the nature of the ownership. It's a matter of how does the ownership manage the enterprise.
Your award. I was wondering if you could speak on, in the new digital era, how have things such as like social media or sharing with your journalists with, major cable news networks or things of that sort, how has that impacted your newsroom?
Well, those are two different things. Is sort of being on the networks, and um, we make a lot of appearances. We probably do over 1,000 appearances of one sort or another every month with our journalists on other media, and it's a way of getting as we try more and more to be a national news organization, which is what we are and what we want to be, and international as well. That we make ourselves available to talk about our journalism, so it's helpful that way. You have to be careful that you not say anything on cable TV or anywhere else that you wouldn't say if you were to write it down, if you were to put it in print. So I'm hopeful that I was careful. And social media is a little different in that, yes, it's a way of distributing our journalism, but it's also a way of people identifying with us as human beings as opposed to just identifying us as an institution, the Washington Post. And because people connect more with individuals than they do with an institution. So people are sort of cultivating their own personality, they want people to know who they really are, which is a good thing that we're actually real human beings. The problem is that you can do some things that human beings are probably not wise to do, and show maybe a little too much of your personality and too many of your opinions. And so at times people have gone over the line. And I think that's true of pretty much every news organization. And so we have a strict set of standards that we expect people to abide by, and we hold them to it. And they come with warnings and things like that. Not everything is the death penalty, but we certainly remind people continuously about what our standards are with regard to social media.
This is a style question. What do you think of the change in reporting of a person's death in news in the last few years? As in, it used to be somebody died, and now it's reported someone has passed away. This is something that I used to read in Salt Lake City newspapers, passed away, gone home. But this has really become very mainstream, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on it.
We still use died.
And I support you.
Yeah. I even use it in talking about, my parents died, but so somebody asked me about, so you can tell your mother. I said, she's dead. It sounds insensitive, but that's the actual, I think it's okay to use. There's nothing insensitive about saying died. That's what happened.
I think it's precise.
Yeah, and so, right. So I think that we should, clearly we should say died. We're sticking with that style, so.
I'm actually going to sneak in one last question if I can. So I have this endless list, and there's just one more thing, because I keep thinking about sort of a common theme throughout this whole conversation, which is about trust in information, trust in our democracy, and I do want to know what you think about how to win back the public's trust from amongst the members of the public that no longer believe in mainstream media, because sometimes in my own more challenging moments, I wonder if it will ever be possible, because we are living in a world due to things like social media where people are living in virtually hermetically sealed bubbles of information. So it's very simple to live without ever consuming any of the news that comes from the Washington Post, for example.
Sure.
So how do you win back trust when there's no communication even?
Yeah, well, it's a huge challenge, and it is one of the biggest challenges that we face. There's no question about it. I'm encouraged somewhat by trust levels actually have gone up a bit over the course of this administration, remarkably. Although it's highly polarized, it's gone up a lot among Democrats, it's gone up moderately among independents, and it's hardly changed. It's at a very low level among Republicans, and that's not a healthy condition for our profession. I think there are a few things that we can do. I don't guarantee the results by any means, but I think there are some things that we can do and are doing, and have to continue to do. Number one is that I think we need to talk a little bit more about who we are. I think there are misconceptions about what our newsrooms are made of. There are people who think that all of the people in the newsroom of the Washington Post, they grew up on the coast, they went to Ivy League schools, they maybe went to elite prep schools or something like that. They're all liberal, they're all this or that. And the reality is that in our newsroom, we have a variety of people. We have military veterans, and we'd like to hire more. We've had people who served in combat. Look, we've been at a country that's been continuously at war since 9/11. It's really important that we have that experience represented in our newsroom. And we don't have enough of it, and we can use more of that. I think it's important. We have people who grew up on family farms. Our deputy national editor grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. One of our White House reporters, he grew up on a corn farm in South Carolina. We have reporters who went to evangelical colleges. One of them grew up in a home of I think it's 9 or 10 kids, I can't remember anymore, and was homeschooled. So we have people from a lot of different backgrounds, people who grew up with meager economic means in their households, and other people who lived, middle class or upper middle class, or even wealthy lives in wealthy families. It's a wide range of people, and people from all over the country. So I think we have to talk about that. I think we have to talk about how we go about our work, be more transparent about that, provide more documents. Look, on the Catholic Church thing, one of the things that made a huge difference, it was the beginnings of really more people using the internet. It was 2002. We were able to post all those documents on the internet. We hadn't been able to do that before. People could read it for themselves. They could see the communications within the archdiocese. They didn't have to just trust us. They could see that our account of what was said there was accurate, was contextual, all of that. So we should post a lot of documents. The letters, what was Mueller's letter? If we're going to provide an account of Mueller's letter to Barr, well, let's post the letter. People can read it for themselves. They don't have to believe us. They don't have to believe Barr. They can just read it, and they can. So we need to do that, and just talk more about how we go about our work and explain the process, and often how difficult it is, particularly for people doing investigative reporting or doing foreign reporting or whatever the case may be. I also think we need to make sure that we are always doing stories the kinds of stories that matter to ordinary people. And that we get out into the country, for us, that we get out into the country, or we get out into all of the communities that we cover, and find the stories that matter to ordinary people, that we are listening to what their concerns are, that we're writing about. If we're doing investigations, that we do investigations that have a real world impact on the lives of ordinary people, not just the political class. And so all of those three things are sort of top of mind for the kinds of things that we can and should do in order to try to improve trust in the media.
What an extraordinary way to